Are you looking to increase your sales with podcast guesting? This episode was originally recorded on my friend Aleasha Bahr's Sales is Not a Dirty Word podcast. Yes, I was a guest on this podcast, and in this podcast, I break down for you our exact strategy for how we get our clients booked on the podcast that build their brand awareness and their bottom line. To listen to the full episode, be sure to tune in to Aleasha Bahr's Sales is Not a Dirty Word podcast everywhere podcasts are heard. The links are in the descriptions. But for now, you get a quick snippet for this week's Quickie. You get the exact strategy we use with our agency clients that allows them to get booked, get customers, get partnerships, get referrals, even before a podcast gets distributed. Stay tuned.
Welcome to the Communication Queens podcast for the visionary leaders, speakers, service providers, and podcasters who are looking to stand out sharing their story. I'm your host, Kimberly Spencer, former screenwriter turned master communications coach. On this podcast, I'll be coaching you on how to share your own transformation story so that you increase your visibility, influence, and income on podcast interviews. Let's get your voice heard.
And you have such a unique point of view that we have not had on this show yet. So I think it's going to be so valuable for anybody listening. And what Kimberly is so good at is making sales through podcast guesting. And you sort of accidentally figured this out, right, Kimberly? How did it happen?
I did. I was on vacation in Australia during COVID, right before COVID hit. Like, we literally landed in the Gold Coast when Tom Hanks announced to the world that he had COVID. And my husband was appearing there at a convention because he's a voice actor. And so he was appearing at a convention with the cast of The Walking Dead. And I thought the universe had an incredible sense of humor. Global pandemic, hanging out with The Walking Dead, they got this.
Yeah.
But my husband and I have always wanted to live in Australia. And so we were there with our son and my parents over there for vacation. And I said, what if we just stayed? Because we kind of saw how Los Angeles was, and I was like, not really loving the fear. And then we saw how Australians were handling it, and they're like a little bit more laid back and just in general. And I was like, I really like Australia. They're taking everything just, pretty nicely, and we'll see how it unfolds, and we get to live in our dream. And I said, yeah. I was running along the beach, and I was like, yeah, let's stay. And we knew we would be going down to a one-income household because I said, well, if the voiceover industry shuts down, like, my husband's like, can you do it? And I was like, yeah, we got this. And so we got to live there, and we thought it would be for a few months, and then it ended up for being 2 years. But the problem was we were in Australia, in a foreign country, on a visitor visa, and I wasn't allowed to use my primary source of lead generation, which had been live events. Like, not only were they not happening, could they not happen on my visa, but they just weren't happening, period, because of COVID. And so I was looking at other forms of lead generation because we were fine with client retention, but it was bringing in new leads that was a challenge. And it was then that I remembered a podcast that I was on that had brought in a $10,000 client. And I was like, what if we just double down on that? Because I'd had my own podcast since 2019, the Crown Yourself podcast, formerly known as The Princess and the Bee. And it was great for continuing to keep people into in my sphere, or like it was a great nurturer tool where people could really build that know, like, and trust factor. But bringing in new people, it wasn't really attracting. And so I looked at podcast guesting, and I was like, yeah, let's double down on that. And we stumbled upon a strategy that worked. Within 9 months, I did 50 podcast interviews, and it generated $70,000 in new business leads. And then now it's generated over $200,000 in new business leads just from podcast guesting alone.
And that is free, y'all.
And it's done for you by the podcaster for free.
Yeah. I see no downsides at all. So what made the difference for you? Are the leads coming from the message that you have? Like, are you very intentional about the types of shows that you're guesting on? Or is it more about talking to the host, or what? Walk us through that.
Yeah. So when we first started, it was just, the goal was to just get me on podcasts. And then when I looked at our revenue and I was like, oh, this is working, I said, I have to teach this to my clients. So I launched a course called Communication Queens that broke it down. And then we launched it again and it failed. And I pulled my audience and I said, why did this fail? And they said, we just want somebody to do it for us. So that's how we started our agency. the
Mm.
Communication Queens agency. And we looked at what really was the cases, like what were the podcasts that converted. So there's multiple ways that you can profit from guest podcasting. But we found that this 3-tier strategy that we created is really the key to looking at what are the podcasts that are going to build your expertise and authority that your ideal client or customer is listening to, and what are those that are correlated to your story, and why those 3. So the first one are the podcasts that build your expertise and authority. These are like the health coach going on other health coaching podcasts.
Mm.
So you're probably not going to get conversions from that because the podcaster who is a health coach, who is established in the industry, has already got their committed following of committed buyers. So it's going to help your brand, yes, and it's going to build your brand awareness as being an expert in your industry. It may not result in conversions.
Mm.
The second one, though, is looking at what are the podcasts that your ideal customer avatar is listening to. So if you look at like who is your ideal customer avatar, and you look at your psychographics and your demographics. So if you notice that a lot of your ideal customers are single mothers, then going on podcasts that are niche for your industry and then podcasts for single mothers about how you as a single mother built your business, then that's going to attract more single moms to your business and to your products.
Mm.
And then the third one is your story. Now, this is one that is, we were originally calling this like your outlier podcast, of like looking at what piece of your outlier really works. But this is where you attack your blue ocean, because I always say people can have the same strategies. Like when I was doing this solely for my coaching business. I do primarily transformational and mindset coaching for business leaders. And there are a bajillion. You just scroll on Instagram and you'll find a mindset coach. But what makes you different is the story that you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were looking at podcasts that like really leverage the power of story. Now, I have very different pieces in my story. I can talk about childhood sexual abuse. I can talk about bulimia. I can talk about my experience with growing up with an addict for a father. I can talk about being surrounded by addiction growing up and those pieces. So there's lots of different pieces that I can talk about in my story that I can go on specific podcasts. Now, why would I choose those podcasts? Well, because those are blue ocean. So and if you're not familiar what blue ocean is, like there was a great book called Blue Ocean Strategy, where if you go into a red ocean, that's where everybody else is. So basically, if you're a coach and you have a blush pink brand and you're on Instagram, you're in a sea of blush pink coaches on Instagram with the rest of the coaches. But if you differentiate yourself and put yourself into a different market, target a different client, based on your story, you're going to have a fresh, clean ocean where it's only going to be you swimming in it instead of you and 50 other blush pink Instagram coaches. So that space allows for a whole fresh pond of people who may not even know that they need you, because they're not listening in that space and what they're going through in their life. If they're listening to specific things that are correlated to your story, and it doesn't always have to be related to trauma. Like, I'm just going to be very clear. I had some trauma growing up in my childhood. I'm very comfortable speaking about my trauma because it's very processed. I always say to my clients, like, never share your unhealed trauma on podcasts. That's not the place. Go to therapy, get that healed, and then you can start sharing your story. Don't share the unhealed trauma. But when it's healed and you're able to talk about certain pieces or aspects of your life or growing up, then it can bring in people who are not necessarily listening for the end result of your business or your product, but because you relate to them on such a deep and personal level, it's going to change the way that they connect with you, that they will want to work with you in some capacity or be involved in your world. That's where your personal brand really comes into play.
That's so interesting. Okay, so if I had narcissistic parents, I could go on a show about narcissistic people in your life and talk about how oftentimes if you had a narcissistic parent, you become an empath. That's usually like the result that unless you become a narcissist. But I don't think narcissists are listening to a show about narcissists, are they? Maybe.
I mean, if you want to be better narcissists.
But I think it's about the trauma I'm talking about. So like if they're traumatized by it, they're probably an empath, and empaths do sales differently. So there could be like a link there.
Yeah. And with especially linking and sharing how it made you create your specific strategy and how you do sales, and really linking and leading into that, because you want to, in any story, like it's storytelling 101. And I started out my career in screenwriting like when I was 19 years old. So that was my first foray into that world. I had my first feature that I co-wrote, picked up and distributed by Lionsgate and on Netflix and on all the places. And so I really dove deep into screenwriting when I was a kid, and read heaps of scripts because I worked for a production company. I'd read tons of bad scripts and tons of good ones. And I always tell people, if they're looking to get into Hollywood and writing movies, I'm like, just know that it's some 17-year-old kid who's reading your script and judging it. Don't feel bad if you get rejected. Just submit it again and try. But that experience of seeing stories and seeing there are certain beats that every story has to have. And if you know that the story of transformation is one that is going to hold an energetic, different vibration, especially if you show and demonstrate a level of courage to what you faced. Courage is an activating emotion. And it's one that you actually want people who are in a positive state, forward thinking, to invest in your products and services. If they're in a state of courage and in an energetic, emotional state of courage, they are believing in the possibility of what can be, which puts them in a much better position as a buyer. So your story, because like attracts like, you also have to reflect that courage.
I love that. That is a very unique insight that I don't think many people are thinking about. So it kind of sounds a little bit like I prefer hope selling as opposed to pain selling. So a lot of people like to dig into the pain and make it really, really bad. And then I'm your only hope. So you have to invest in me. That brings somebody in a weird mindset.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that if you were just talking about how awful it was and you didn't really like show what's possible on the other side of it as an example, like what you're talking about, you're basically the example of it, then you could attract people who were in a place of scarcity or just fear. So that's such an incredible insight.
I hope you loved this episode of this sneak peek behind the scenes on a podcast that I was blessed to be a guest on. And this is just a reminder that our bi-monthly podcasting party is happening this week. So if you want to meet and learn from top 5% podcasters, then definitely hop on into the podcasting party, where we play bingo, give away hundreds of dollars in prizes, and have so much fun connecting and sharing in an intimate medium that allows for us to play with our pitches. So pitch please, head on over to the link in the show notes to register for the podcast party this week. I'll see you there.
Thank you so much for listening. If you love this episode, subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. For more tips on guest podcasting, storytelling, and communication strategies, follow us on social media at Communication Queens Agency and visit us at communicationqueens.com. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. And in the meantime, remember, your story has the power to save one life. Let your story and your voice be heard.